I've always hated hospitals. The sterile smell, the cold lighting, the eerie silence that hangs in the air even during the busiest times. It all felt wrong to me, but as a medical intern, I didn't have much of a choice. The worst part wasn't even the endless paperwork or the long hours. It was the night shifts. Something about being there when the world was asleep felt unsettling. And on that particular night, it felt far worse. It started like any other shift. The ER had been slow, just a few minor cases, and the staff was unusually quiet. Around midnight, I was assigned to check on a patient in room 308. I hadn't seen her file before, and the chart was sparse. Just a name, Margaret Dawson, and a note that she was in a coma. Nothing else, no family contacts, no history of how long she'd been here. Odd, but not unheard of. As I approached her room, the hallway seemed unnaturally dim, like the light had been sucked out of it. The fluorescent bulbs flickered slightly, casting eerie shadows. I hesitated before opening the door, my hand hovering just above the handle. I remember thinking that I should turn back, that something about this felt wrong, but I had a job to do. The moment I stepped inside, I was hit by an overwhelming sense of unease. Margaret lay there, her face sunken and pale, her body still as if life had long left it. Machines beeped softly, keeping her barely tethered to the living world. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I stood by her bedside, going through the usual routine, checking vitals, adjusting her for. My eyes kept drifting to her face. It was gaunt, hollow, yet something about it seemed tense, like she was waiting for something. And that's when I noticed it, her mouth. It was slightly open, her lips parted just enough for me to see her teeth. But her mouth wasn't relaxed. It was straining, like she was trying to scream. I leaned in closer, and for a second, I thought I could hear something. A faint, almost imperceptible noise, like the distant hum of a machine. But it wasn't a machine. It was coming from her. I leaned in closer, my ear almost brushing her lips, and then I heard it. A scream. But it wasn't audible. It was inside my head, piercing, desperate, and filled with terror. It wasn't just a scream. It was as if her soul was crying out for help, begging to be released from whatever nightmare she was trapped in. I jerked back, stumbling into the wall, my heart racing. My mind scrambled to make sense of it. Had I imagined it? The room was as silent as before, Margaret still unmoving. But the scream, I could still feel it echoing in my skull. I left the room quickly, my hands shaking as I closed the door behind me. I tried to compose myself, rationalize what had just happened. Maybe it was exhaustion, a hallucination brought on by stress. I returned to the nurse's station and casually asked about Margaret. The head nurse looked at me with a confused expression. Margaret Dawson? Are you sure you've got the right name? I nodded, showing her the chart. Her face paled as she flipped through the pages. There must be some mistake. Margaret Dawson died 3 days ago. Her body was transferred to the morgue. Room 308 is empty. I froze, my blood turning to ice. I had just been in that room. I had seen her, heard her. Without thinking, I rushed back down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I threw open the door to room 308, my heart pounding in my chest. The bed was empty. The sheets were neatly folded, the machines turned off. There was no sign anyone had been there for days. I left the hospital that night and never returned. The scream still haunts me, though. Every now and then, I hear it. A faint, desperate cry just on the edge of my mind. I know Margaret is still out there, trapped in some horrific limbo, and her silent scream will never stop. Not until someone listens. I tried to bury that night deep in my mind, convincing myself it was some kind of breakdown, a result of the relentless hours and stress. But no matter how hard I pushed it away, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. At night, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, hearing that same silent scream in my dreams. The sound felt closer now, more insistent, like Margaret was clawing her way back into my life. I started seeing flashes of her face in my periphery, a quick glimpse of sunken eyes or a straining mouth, but when I'd turn, there was nothing. My colleagues noticed how rattled I'd become, but I couldn't tell them. How could I explain something like this? Then, a week later, I got a phone call from the hospital. They were asking about a patient, Margaret Dawson. They said her body had disappeared from the morgue. No signs of forced entry, no explanation. Just gone. My blood ran cold. The hospital administration was baffled, thinking it was a terrible mistake. But I knew better. Margaret wasn't just a memory haunting me. She was out there, somewhere, searching for someone to hear her scream. And deep down, I feared that someone was me. A few days later, I started receiving strange calls in the middle of the night, each one dead silent. At first, I tried to ignore them, but they became more frequent, more persistent, until the silence on the other end started to feel familiar. I couldn't shake the sense that someone, or something, was listening on the other side, waiting for me to respond. One night, as the phone rang again, I answered, my voice shaking. "Margaret," I whispered, feeling ridiculous the moment the name left my lips. But then, in that thick, unbearable silence, I heard it, the scream. No longer just a feeling, no longer trapped in my mind. It pierced through the phone, shattering any hope that I could escape her. The scream filled my house, my head, and my very soul, and I knew then there was no running from it. Margaret had found her voice, and I was the one who would never escape the silence again.